It was 4 in the morning when Ruth got up and started making the pie. Not because anyone asked her to. Not because someone was coming over. She got up because she could not sleep, and because her hands, after 31 years of early mornings in that kitchen, did not know how to stay still. She didn't turn on the overhead light. She didn't need to. She knew where everything was. The flour canister, second shelf, the rolling pin hanging on the nail beside the window, the sweet potatoes she had boiled the night before and left to cool in a bowl on the counter. Her hands moved through the dark kitchen the way water moves through a familiar valley, without thinking, without effort, just following the shape of things. Outside, the Nebraska wind was pressing against the house. It was November, the kind of cold that doesn't knock. It just walks in through the walls like it owns the place. The fields were frozen, the trees were bare, everything out there looked like it had already given up. Inside, the kitchen smelled like butter and cinnamon. Ruth pressed the crust into her mother's old pie tin, dented on one edge from a drop it had survived sometime in the 1970s, and she did not cry. She had done enough crying in the past 11 months. Somewhere around month 4, the crying had just quietly run out, the way a well runs dry. Not because the grief was gone, just because the body gets tired of it. Gerald had died the previous December. Heart attack. Fast, the doctor said, like that was something. Like fast made it easier. Like she hadn't spent 31 years sleeping next to that man, raising 2 kids in that house, planting the same garden every April. Like fast explained the way the other side of the bed felt now. Not just empty but wrong, like a word with a letter missing that your eye keeps catching on. The farm had followed him out the door 6 months later. Not all at once. Debt doesn't come in all at once. It comes in pieces, politely, with paperwork. First the missed payment, then the letter, then the meeting at the bank with a young man in a clean shirt who kept saying he understood. And Ruth kept thinking, you don't. You are 29 years old and you are wearing a tie your mother probably pressed, and you have never once watched something you spent your whole life building just stop. The foreclosure notice had been sitting on the kitchen table for 3 weeks now. She'd stopped turning it face down. It didn't change what it said. She spooned the sweet potato filling into the crust. Brown sugar, a little nutmeg, the vanilla she kept in a small brown bottle behind the salt. She didn't measure. She never measured. This recipe lived in her hands, not on any card. The oven ticked and hummed. The kitchen filled up with warmth. She covered the pie with a dish towel when it came out, the way you cover something you're not ready to look at yet. And she set it on the counter to cool. Then she filled the kettle and put it on the stove. She set out 2 mugs. She stood there for a moment looking at them. 2 mugs, same as always, side by side on the counter, just like every morning for 31 years. She picked one up and put it back in the cabinet. Stood there, both hands on the counter edge. Didn't move for a while. The kettle started to whistle, and she made her coffee, and she sat down alone at the kitchen table, in the house she would have to leave in 9 days, and she drank it in the dark. The foreclosure notice was right there beside her coffee cup. She didn't look at it. She looked at the window instead, at the black Nebraska sky that was just barely beginning to think about turning gray at the edges. She had $53 in her checking account. She had 1 pie cooling on the counter. She had a daughter in Arizona who had offered the spare room and a son in Oregon who had offered money, and she had told both of them no thank you. Not yet. Give me a little time, though she could not have said what she was waiting for. Maybe just this. 1 more morning in her own kitchen. 1 more pie. 1 more cup of coffee in the place where she had made her life, before she had to figure out what came next. She was 58 years old, and she had never in her life not known what came next. There is a particular kind of scared that doesn't shake you or make you loud. It just sits down inside your chest and gets comfortable, like it plans to stay. Ruth had been living with that kind for months now, and she had learned that the only thing that helped, even a little, even for an hour, was to make something. To take ingredients that didn't amount to anything on their own and turn them into something that could feed a person. So that's what she did. At 4 in the morning, in the dark, in the cold, on the 9th day before she had to leave. She made a pie. She wasn't sure who it was for yet, but she had made it, and it was real, and it smelled like something, and for right now that was enough. Across the kitchen, the pie tin sat on the counter under its dish towel, dented at the edge. Her mother's. The only piece of kitchen equipment she knew for a fact she was taking when she left. Not because it was valuable, because her mother had used it, and her mother's mother before that, and now her. 3 women who had stood in 3 different kitchens in hard years and made something out of almost nothing, not because anyone told them to, but because that's what their hands knew how to do. Ruth finished her coffee. The sky outside was gray now at the bottom and still dark at the top, that strange in-between color that belongs to no part of the day. She rinsed her mug, set it on the rack to dry, looked at the pie. She still didn't know who it was for, but somewhere, between the dark and the not yet light, she had already started thinking about Dale Alderman, 12 miles east, whose daughter had called her 2 weeks ago sounding worried, saying he wasn't eating right, saying he'd been alone out there since his wife passed in the spring, saying, "Ruth, you know him a little, maybe you could." Ruth had said she'd think about it. She looked at the pie. She was still thinking about it. She drove out there on a Tuesday, 12 miles east on a county road that ran straight as a ruler through flat, frozen fields. The pie was on the passenger seat, still in its tin, wrapped in a clean dish towel. Ruth kept one hand on the wheel and one eye on it every time she hit a bump, like it was something she was responsible for delivering in one piece, which she supposed it was. She almost turned around twice. The first time was about 4 miles out, when she started thinking about how strange this was, driving a pie to a man she had spoken to maybe a dozen times in her life, mostly at church or the co-op, mostly just nods and how-do-you-dos. The second time was at his gate, when she sat in the truck for a full minute with the engine running, pie on the seat beside her, wondering what exactly she planned to say when the door opened. She still hadn't figured it out when she knocked. Dale Alderman opened the door and looked at her. He was a tall man, built the way men get built when they spend their whole lives doing physical work. Not gym built, just solid, like a post that's been in the ground a long time and has no interest in coming out. His face was weathered and careful. He had the kind of eyes that didn't move fast. He looked at Ruth, then at the pie, then at Ruth again. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "You'd better come in." The kitchen was clean, but it had that particular emptiness that happens in a house when the person who gave it its shape is gone. Everything was in the right place. Nothing felt right. Ruth recognized it immediately, because she had been living inside the same emptiness for 11 months. She set the pie on his kitchen table. She unwrapped it. She said his daughter had called and mentioned he hadn't been eating much, and she had made this, and hoped it was all right she came by. Dale pulled out a chair and sat down. He said, That was the entire response. Ruth looked around for something useful to do with herself. There was a stack of mail on the counter, and a coffee pot that looked like it had been through a war. She found 2 mugs in the cabinet. She did not think too hard about the mugs, and poured coffee she hadn't been offered but assumed was available, because it was a ranch kitchen and that's how ranch kitchens work. That was when the dog appeared. It came around the corner from the hallway. A cattle dog, black and tan and white, with one ear up and one ear that had made a different decision. It looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at it. The dog walked over, sat directly on both of Ruth's feet, and put its chin on her knee. "That's Persimmon," Dale said, watching this happen. "Hello, Persimmon," Ruth said. The dog's tail moved once, like a period at the end of a sentence. For the next 20 minutes, Ruth spoke almost exclusively to the dog. She told Persimmon it was very cold outside, and the roads were getting icy. She told Persimmon the sweet potatoes in the pie had come from her own garden, which she supposed wasn't her garden anymore, which was fine. She told Persimmon that it had a very sensible face. Dale cut himself a slice of pie, then a second one. He ate both without a word. Ruth, still talking to the dog, understood this perfectly. In her experience, there were 2 kinds of compliments: the kind that people give with words because they feel they ought to say something, and the kind that comes out as a second slice of pie before the first one is even fully gone. The second kind was the only one that ever meant anything. By the time the coffee was finished, something had shifted in the room, though neither of them could have said what exactly. It wasn't that they had become close. They hadn't talked about anything real. They had talked about the weather and the price of feed, and whether the creek road would freeze over by Thursday, and Persimmon had moved from Ruth's feet to directly beside her chair and had pressed its whole side against her leg. Ruth picked up her dish towel, she never left a dish towel, and stood to go. Dale stood too. He picked up the pie tin to hand back to her, then looked at it. There were still 4 or 5 slices left. "Take it," Ruth said. "Finish it." He set it back down. He said, "All right." He walked her to the door. Out on the porch the wind was sharp and the sky was the color of old tin. The field stretched out in every direction, flat and wide and very still. Ruth started toward her truck. Dale said from the porch, "That was good pie." She turned and looked at him. He was already looking at Persimmon, who had followed Ruth to the door, and was now sitting on the porch mat with that same one ear up, one ear down expression, watching her like it had opinions about whether she should leave. "Thank you," Ruth said. She drove home. The passenger seat was empty now, just the shape of the dish towel where the pie tin had been. She didn't go back to the motel right away. She drove a little, down the county roads, past frozen fields and bare trees and the occasional farmhouse with its lights on in the early dark. She thought about the way Dale had eaten that second slice, quietly, like a man who hadn't tasted something that reminded him of a different time in a good while, and wasn't going to make a big deal out of the fact that it did. She thought about the look on his face when he opened the door. Not surprised she was there exactly. More like, ready, like some part of him had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to knock. Ruth understood that feeling. She had been walking around with it herself. She wasn't sure what any of it amounted to. She was leaving in 8 days. She had $53 in a pie tin and no plan past the end of the week. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had done the right thing, whatever that was worth. She pointed the truck back toward the motel and drove into the dark. Dale showed up at the motel on a Tuesday. He pulled up in a truck that sounded like it had a grudge against the cold, knocked on the door of room 7, and when Ruth opened it, he said, "Heater's gone out in the cab. Thought you might know someone." Ruth looked at him. She had not seen him since the pie, which was 5 days ago. She was wearing her coat inside because the motel heater was not what you would call reliable. She said, "I don't know anyone, but let me look at it." He blinked. "You know trucks?" "I know cold," she said, and grabbed her coat off the chair. She did not, in fact, know trucks. Not technically, but she had spent 30 years married to a man who fixed things by looking at them long enough, and she had absorbed more than she realized. She stood in the parking lot of the Route 20 motel in November cold, leaned over the open hood, and looked. Then she said, "That wire there, the one that's not connected to anything." Dale leaned over beside her, looked, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Huh." He went back to the ranch, reconnected the wire, and the heater worked. He called Ruth that evening. She didn't know how he got the motel number, but assumed the same way he knew everything, which was asking the right person one time, and said, "That was it." "I figured," she said. There was a pause. Then he said, "You want to come out tomorrow? Got some bookkeeping I can't make sense of." She said she'd come out at 9. She didn't examine why she said yes. She just said yes. Over the next 2 weeks, the visits became regular without anyone deciding they would. She came out to help with the ranch accounts, which were not complicated, just ignored. And while she was there, she noticed the back gate was dragging across the ground instead of swinging properly. So she fixed the hinge. And while she was doing that, she noticed the fence post next to it was leaning. So she asked Dale where he kept the post hole digger, and he showed her, and they got the post back in together, without talking much except about the post. That was how things worked between them. Practical and side by side. Not a lot of words, but a shared understanding of what needed doing next. Some people talk to get close. Ruth and Dale were not those people. They worked to get close. And it happened the same way, maybe faster, because working beside someone tells you things about them that talking never does. You learn how they respond when something doesn't go right. You learn what they find funny and what they take seriously, and how long they're willing to push before they step back and rethink. Dale was patient. That was the main thing. He didn't rush a single thing she'd seen him do. He'd stand and look at a problem for a while before he touched it, like he was waiting for it to explain itself. Ruth was the opposite. She moved toward a problem immediately. If it pushed back, she pushed harder. If it was a post, she got the digger. If it was accounts, she found the receipts in the drawer he hadn't opened in 8 months and organized them into piles on his kitchen table until they made sense. One afternoon she found a coffee can in the back of the barn full of receipts going back 3 years, mixed in with some twine and a broken compass, and she brought it inside and emptied it on the table without asking, because it needed to be done. Dale walked in, looked at the pile, looked at her, and said, "I was going to get to that." "I know," she said. He sat down across from her and started sorting. The motel room cost $62 a night, which was more than Ruth had but not more than her credit card. She watched the number on her card go down every morning when she checked out and back up every evening when she checked back in, and she told herself she was figuring something out. She just hadn't figured it yet. Her daughter called every few days. Her son called on Sundays. Both of them offered solutions she kept politely refusing. She couldn't have explained exactly why. There was something happening here, something taking shape, and she felt, without being able to say it, that leaving before it finished taking shape would be the wrong thing. One afternoon, near the end of the second week, she was going through a box of files in Dale's back office when she reached into her coat pocket for a pen and found instead a folded piece of paper. She knew what it was before she opened it. The recipe she'd written down for Gerald, years ago, when his mother asked for it. He'd kept it in his jacket. She'd forgotten it was in the coat she'd inherited back from the closet in November. His handwriting was on the back. A grocery list, half finished. Butter, the 2%, not the whole. She folded it back up, stood in the doorway of Dale's back office for a little while, looking at a fence post through the window. Then she put the paper back in her pocket and went back to the files. She did not say anything about it. Not to Dale, not to anyone. Grief, she had learned, didn't want an audience. It just wanted a minute, and then it wanted you to get back to what you were doing. So that's what she did. When Dale came in at 4 for coffee, she had finished the accounts and found an overcharge from the feed supplier that went back 6 months. She showed him. He looked at the numbers, then at her. She shrugged. "You were paying too much." He said, "Apparently." He made the coffee. She sat at his kitchen table with Persimmon's head in her lap and the winter light coming through the window at a low angle, the kind that turns everything a little gold, and she thought, "I have nothing. I have $53 and a credit card with a dropping balance and a motel room and nowhere to be in the morning." And also, somehow, she had this. Whatever this was. She didn't name it. She just kept showing up. Every day she kept showing up. And every day there was something to do. And every day it felt a little less like she was disappearing, and a little more like she was arriving somewhere, even if she couldn't quite see where yet. That was enough for now. It had to be. Dale brought it up on a Wednesday, the way he brought everything up, facing the window, talking to the glass. He said the guest room at the back of the house wasn't being used. He said the motel sounded expensive. He said this to the window and then stopped talking, like the offer was in those 2 sentences if she wanted to find it there. And if she didn't, then he hadn't quite said it and they could both move on. Ruth was at the kitchen table, going through December utility bills. She didn't look up right away. She kept her eyes on the paper in front of her and let the sentence sit in the room between them for a moment. Then she said, "I'll think about it." She moved in on Saturday. She didn't make a big thing of it. She drove over with 2 boxes in the truck bed and her coat on the passenger seat, and the dented pie tin wrapped in the dish towel in between. Dale was in the barn when she arrived. Persimmon met her at the truck door and walked beside her to the house like it had been assigned to escort duty. The guest room was off the back hallway, past the coat hooks and the shelf of old field maps. It smelled like cedar and thyme, the smell of a room that had been kept clean and empty for a while, waiting for a reason to be used. There was a window facing east, a narrow bed, a wooden dresser with a mirror that caught the afternoon light and threw it in a stripe across the floor. Ruth set her boxes down. She stood there for a moment. She had not had a room of her own. Not really, not since she was a girl, without it also being a shared room. She and Gerald had shared a room for 31 years. The motel room was technically hers, but it had never felt like anything except a place she was waiting to leave. This room was small, cedar-smelling. The light came in at a low winter angle. Outside the window, flat Nebraska fields stretched to the horizon. She put her clothes in the dresser. She set the pie tin on the windowsill. She went back out to the truck for the second box, and she didn't let herself think too hard about any of it. What Ruth had learned about herself in the past year was that she couldn't look directly at the hard things. She had to approach them sideways, the way you approach a nervous animal. Don't look straight at it. Move slow. Don't make it feel like what it is. Moving into this house, she could not look straight at what that was, because if she looked straight at it, she would have to admit she was relieved, and if she admitted she was relieved, she would have to admit she had been afraid, and if she admitted she had been afraid, she would have to look at just how bad those months had really been. The motel, the dropping credit card, the mornings when she sat on the edge of the bed and didn't move for 20 minutes because she genuinely could not think of a reason to. She couldn't look at all of that, so instead she reorganized the kitchen. She'd noticed since her first visit that Dale's kitchen was organized by someone who had never once thought about how kitchens get used. The spices were in a drawer with the spatulas. The sugar was on the highest shelf. The coffee was in 3 different locations for reasons she could not determine. She fixed all of this on her first day in the house. Then she decided she wasn't happy with where she'd put the spices, so she moved them again. Then she moved the canned goods to a lower shelf and organized them by type, and for a while she wasn't thinking about anything except where the lentils should go, and whether the canned tomatoes should be with the canned vegetables or in their own category. Dale came in for lunch, opened the cabinet, found the coffee on a completely different shelf, and poured himself a cup without commenting on any of it. This was one of the things Ruth was beginning to understand about him. He didn't remark on things he didn't have standing to remark on. The kitchen was her space now. She had claimed it within 48 hours with the efficiency of someone who had always known what a kitchen was supposed to feel like. And whatever she did in it was, as far as Dale was concerned, not his business. He moved around her the way you move around something still finding its footing, giving it room, not pushing. Meals started happening at regular hours. This sounds small and wasn't. For the past year, Ruth had been eating at the motel, or in her car, or at whatever hour she happened to notice she was hungry, and Dale, by his own admission, had been doing something similar. Coffee at dawn, a sandwich at some point, not much else. Whatever required the least effort. Now there was dinner at 6. Not elaborate, not a performance, just food, made correctly, at a regular hour, eaten at a table by 2 people and a dog. Persimmon took a new position in the household once Ruth moved in. Previously, the dog had slept on a rug at the foot of Dale's bed. Now Persimmon slept across the doorway of whichever room had the light on last, like a self-appointed night watchman who couldn't quite decide who needed watching more. Ruth found this deeply reassuring in a way she didn't examine. The fear was still there. She was honest enough with herself to know that. It had changed shape a little. It was less the fear of falling and more the fear of having something to lose again. That particular fear is almost worse, in some ways, because it means you've already admitted you want something. And wanting something, in Ruth's experience, was how you ended up sitting alone at a kitchen table at 4 in the morning, with 1 coffee mug instead of 2. She dealt with the fear the way she dealt with everything. She kept her hands busy, and she kept showing up. She fixed the latch on the mudroom door that stuck in cold weather. She put weather stripping around the kitchen window. She ordered a new part for the barn heater that Dale had been putting off ordering for 2 years, because ordering things online was, apparently, outside his skill set. One Thursday afternoon in mid-December, She peeled apples without deciding to. Her hands just started doing it while she was standing at the counter thinking about something else. And by the time she looked down, she had a bowl of peeled apples and the crust dough was already resting on the board. She made the pie. Not for a guest. Not for a death. Not for a neighbor. Not for any occasion. She made it because the apples on the counter were getting soft, and because the kitchen was warm, and because her hands wanted to make something. She made it because she was home. Or, not quite home. Something like home. Close enough that her hands believed it even if the rest of her wasn't ready to say the word out loud. When Dale came in at 4 and saw the pie cooling on the counter, he looked at it for a moment, then sat down at the table and didn't say anything. A few minutes later he got up, cut himself a slice, and sat back down. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. He just ate it, slowly, with both hands around his coffee cup afterward, looking out the window at the last of the winter light. Ruth sat across from him with Persimmon's head in her lap, and the cedar smell from the back room, drifting through the hallway, and the fields going dark outside. The pie tin sat on the counter, dented at the edge. It had been through a lot, that tin. Different kitchens, different decades, different women standing over it in difficult years. And now this kitchen, this year, this particular winter. Ruth ran her thumb along the dent when she picked it up to wash it later, the same way she always did. The same gesture her mother had made, and probably her mother before that. Old habit, old tin, new kitchen. Something like home. Almost. By March, the ranch had thawed and gotten loud. Cattle loud. Weather loud. The creek in the east pasture running full and fast after a wet February. The barn swallows coming back in and rebuilding in the rafters like they owned the place, which Dale said they basically did. The fields were soft and dark and starting to smell the way good ground smells in spring. Alive, mineral, like something waking up. Ruth was outside more. She'd taken on the kitchen garden in the fenced corner beside the house. It had been sitting empty since Dale's wife, by the name of Carol, had kept it, and Ruth had looked at it through the kitchen window all winter, until the looking became deciding. She turned the bed in early March, before it was probably sensible to, but the ground cooperated. Dale watched her do it from the fence. Too early, he said. Maybe, she said. She kept turning. He came out the next morning and helped without being asked. That was them now. That was how things went. They disagreed about things regularly and practically. The east fence line, whether the barn cat was too thin, the best way to handle the billing for the second herd, and they resolved those disagreements the way practical people resolve them, which is to say one of them tries it their way, and if it works, that settles it, and if it doesn't, the other one doesn't gloat, because what's the point? The tomatoes were a running disagreement that did not get resolved. Ruth wanted the large beefsteak variety, the kind that go big and ugly and taste like a tomato is supposed to taste. Dale had always planted the smaller Roma variety, because, he said, they were easier to deal with. Ruth said easier wasn't the point. Dale said that was easy for her to say. Ruth said she'd been gardening longer than he had, and he said that wasn't verifiable, and she said, oh yes it was. They planted both. The kitchen, by spring, had been reorganized 4 times, and had finally landed somewhere Ruth was satisfied with. Dale had stopped noticing where things were, and had simply accepted that if he looked in a reasonable place, he would eventually find what he needed, and so far this had been true. Meals were at regular hours. Coffee was at 6. Dinner was at 6. These were not rules they'd made. They'd just emerged, the way a schedule emerges when 2 people share a space long enough and find the rhythm that fits them both. Persimmon had settled into a routine as the household's emotional monitor. If Ruth was in the kitchen, Persimmon was in the kitchen. If Dale was in the barn, Persimmon was in the barn. If there was a disagreement happening in the house, Persimmon was sitting precisely in the middle of the floor between them, looking back and forth with that one ear up, one ear down face, as if waiting to see who would be reasonable first. In March, Ruth ran into Dale's neighbor, a woman named Pat, at the county co-op. Pat was someone Ruth had known vaguely. A church face, a fair face, Someone she'd nodded to for years without ever having a real conversation with. They stopped beside the seed display, and Pat asked how Ruth was doing, and then said she'd heard she'd been out at the Alderman place, and asked if that was still going. Ruth said yes. Pat said, "So you're living out there now?" And Ruth said, without hesitating, without thinking about it, without the split-second pause that had always come before when she'd been asked about her situation since last December, she just said, "Yes, out at the Alderman place. Not staying temporarily, not living out of a motel room while she figured things out. Just out at the Alderman place." She heard herself say it. She kept talking to Pat, said something about the garden and the spring thaw, and Pat said something back, and they went on talking for a few minutes, the way people do at the co-op. And the whole time, Ruth was holding that sentence in the back of her mind, turning it over quietly. Out at the Alderman place. She'd said it the way you say a thing that's been true for a while. Not like news, not like an explanation, like it was just a fact about her, where she was from, where she belonged. She drove back to the ranch with 2 bags of seed potatoes in the truck bed and the windows down, because the March air smelled good, and it was the kind of afternoon that makes you feel like something is possible, though you can't quite name what. Dale was in the east pasture when she got back. Persimmon came to meet the truck. Ruth carried the seed bags to the garden shed, and then stood in the yard for a minute, looking at the place. She looked at the house, the porch with the loose board she'd been meaning to fix since January, the kitchen window with the light on, the mudroom door she'd weather-stripped in December, and which no longer stuck in the cold. She looked at the garden bed she'd turned too early, where the garlic was already showing green spikes through the dark soil. She looked at the barn with its swallows rebuilding in the rafters, and the cattle moving in the east field, and Dale's truck parked at an angle the way he always parked it, slightly diagonal to the driveway, which drove Ruth a little crazy, but which she had stopped mentioning because some things you just accept about a person. She thought about that November morning, the dark kitchen, the rolling pin, the 2 coffee mugs on the counter, the one she put back, the particular kind of alone that had settled into her chest that morning like it planned to stay. She thought about the foreclosure notice, and the motel, and the $53. She thought about driving 12 miles east with a pie on the passenger seat, not knowing what she was going to say when the door opened. She didn't know then that the pie was the beginning of something. She hadn't been thinking about beginnings. She'd been thinking about getting through the morning, and then through the day, and then through the week, because that was all she had the capacity for. But here is the thing about people who are built the way Ruth is built. They don't stop. They can lose their home and their husband and their plan for the future and their reason to set 2 coffee mugs instead of 1, and they will still get up at 4 in the morning and make something out of almost nothing, not because they're optimistic, not because they feel sure it's going to work out, but because that's just what their hands know how to do. Make something. Feed someone. Keep going. The ranch had needed her. That was the truth of it. Not in a dramatic way. Not in any way that anybody would write a story about. Just quietly needed. The way a place gets when its rhythm is off and doesn't know why. The accounts in a drawer. The receipts in a coffee can. The fence gate dragging. The heater part sitting on a website in someone's shopping cart for 2 years. Ruth had fixed the things that needed fixing. And somewhere in the middle of that, the place had fixed her back. Not all the way. She still thought about Gerald every morning when she woke up. She still reached, some mornings, for the piece of paper in her coat pocket, just to look at the grocery list. She still had whole days where the grief sat down in her chest and got comfortable, and she just worked around it, because there's nothing else you can do. But she was here. She was in a house with a cedar-smelling back room and a dog that slept across the hallway and a kitchen that finally made sense, and a garden with garlic already coming up, and a man who disagreed with her about tomatoes and helped her turn the beds before the frost was fully out of the ground. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal. The next morning she got up at 5:30. She was sleeping better now, didn't need the 4 a.m. start, and she made coffee. She set out 2 mugs. She didn't think about it. Her hands just did it, the way they always had. Both mugs got used. Dale came in at 6, poured his coffee, sat across from her at the kitchen table. Persimmon was on the floor between them. Outside, the fields were light and gray and wet-looking, the way they get when spring is working on them. They didn't talk about much. The cattle, the weather, whether the potatoes should go in this week or wait another 10 days. The loose board on the porch. Normal things. Small things. The kind of things that only feel small until you've had a year without them. The pie tin was on the shelf between the salt jar and the window. Dented at the edge. It had been Ruth's mother's and her mother's mother's before that. 3 women, 3 kitchens, hard years. A tin that had survived every one of them. It sat in the morning light like it had always been there. Like it had finally found its shelf.